Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be talking about poetry with award-winning poet Jay Rogoff of Saratoga. All right, thanks for coming, Jay, to our library. Today we're here to talk about poetry. Jay is a local poet. He teaches up at Skidmore. He's the author of 3 books, The Cutoff, which won the Washington Prize for Poetry, First Hand, which won the John Masefield Memorial Award, and his latest book, How We Came to Stand on That Shore. So, welcome to our Meet the Author series.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a good place to start is why poetry as opposed to any other art form? Why do you write in this genre, I guess?
It's really a good question. When I was in college, I actually wrote fiction, and I have at home on my shelf somewhere a very bad novel that I wrote about 15 years ago, and half of one that's a little better that I hope to get back to. But poetry is what I always keep coming back to and focus on for a couple of reasons. One is the concentration of poetry, that the challenge of saying a lot in a little space is important to me, and I like to keep that going as much as possible to try to enclose an entire imaginative universe in a very small space. The other thing that poetry lets me do much more than fiction was when I was trying fiction is to work in rhythms and sound in a way that would be too oppressive if you tried to do it for the length of a short story, even much less a novel. I work in rhyme a fair amount. That comes from the early influence of Dr. Seuss, I think. And I want the reader to attend to what I'm doing with sound in a poem in a way that would be difficult to maintain in a longer work.
Story. So then, I know I could probably ask 100 poets this. What is a poem? I'd probably get 100 different answers. So how would you define a poem as opposed to, poetry with a capital P?
Yeah, we're starting with the easy questions here, I see. Well, a poem is, we can think of a poem in a couple of different ways. One way I like to think about it is a series of strategies upon the understanding of a reader. So that you have, let's say you have a sonnet. You have something that's 14 lines long. You have something that is going to happen at, say, line 4. Well, you have a way to start it. Then you have something that you designed to happen at line 4. Then you have something that you know is going to happen as you go from line 8 to 9. And I don't mean to make it sound that mechanical, but continually the poet is trying to think of how to create particular emotional responses in the reader and what is the best way to get those across. So it's a process of getting what is in here out there. That's true of any writing, but the poet particularly has a set of tools like metaphor and simile and rhythm, rhyme, by which he can create emotional effects in the reader. So one way is that we've got a series of strategies, a series of emotional effects that are intended upon a reader. Another thing that a poem is a small piece of virtual reality. We think of virtual reality as something that is just very obviously imitative of what we see, and a poem invites you into its imaginative world, and it asks you to come to terms with the voice in the poem, with the events in the poem, and to participate in them imaginatively as a reader. So again, I like to think of poems as small nuggets of virtual reality.
Are you trying to consciously for that emotional effect? I mean, do you think of the effect and then go work toward it, or does it just sort of come out by the time you're done writing it, I guess.
Sometimes you do, and sometimes that's something that comes in revising. Sometimes I begin with wanting to write about something.
Yeah.
Sometimes I begin with an idea or an image that then I see what I can develop it into. And sometimes I really begin with wanting to create a particular emotional effect. I want to have my reader experience some kind of terrible disappointment or terrible shock, and then I figure out what's the best way to do that.
Or like,
But that's usually
Yeah.
a sort of revising.
well, I'm thinking
strategy.
of the James Joyce, the idea of the epiphany. Is that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's analogous. And Joyce is experimenting with some very short stories that are almost poetry-like in the book where he first hits on this idea of the epiphany, the Dubliners, and of course he's able to do it. He's a master, so he's able to do it in much longer structures as well. But yeah, the epiphany, the revelation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, perhaps you could give us an example. Read one of your poems or two.
Yeah, let me show you a poem in which I hope that works. And this is a poem that I wrote not too long ago, and it's inspired by current events. It's not a terribly personal poem, except insofar as the beliefs that are behind it. And it's a poem called "Folding the Flag." Let me read it first, and then I'll say some things about it. Folding the flag. With a lover or friend, stretch it out waist height and parallel to the ground. Fold lengthwise, so blue midnight and its strict constellation vanishes under pure white and blood red, a frisson along the stripes shot between you. Fold again lengthwise, a lot like unmaking a bed in which no one is ever just sleeping. The stars should stay outside, as in the universe. From the stripy end, fold it up in small triangles, kissing when you meet. Tuck in the end, creating a cocked newspaper hat from whole cloth, a thing useful in comforting a suddenly public wife, suddenly veiled, her gold ring shining like eternal life, like moist eyes, like the bright stars in her jaunty souvenir cap, the weight of their universe pressing into her lap.
Now, when I first read that, the image at the end of obviously the war widow is a very strong image. I mean, I didn't know it was leading to that. So that's a very sort of powerful poem.
Oh, thank you. And that's the kind of that's the kind of epiphany that I wanted. So epiphany is a nice word. I'm actually flattered by it. But and so I wanted the reader to enter into the poem and wonder, okay, where is this going? And of course, it's informed by current events. It's informed by the Iraq War, and I got to thinking about how, with all the flags that were being displayed, there were certain flags that we were not permitted to see, the flags that were coming back on the coffins, and so I just I did a little research. I went out on the internet, not the best place for research, but I found instructions about the official instructions about how you fold the flag, and so I included them in a kind of playful way here. But I had the folding the flag culminate in something other than the simple ceremony.
Okay. Do you have another example that you could give?
Yeah, let's.
Well, while you're looking, I just had a question. Do
Yeah, go ahead.
sometimes with a poem, do some just sort of come through divine inspiration, or do some take or do some take literally months to write? I was thinking of one of my favorite poets, Philip Larkin. He would agonize for months over whatever, a little 10-line poem, but literally months. I was wondering, do sometimes yours take months or
Sometimes
weeks,
they take years.
There are
some that come very, very quickly, and you think of those as gifts.
Okay.
There are a handful of poems that I've written, and boy, I don't know if I can put my hands on one right now. I'm thinking of one, but I don't have it with me here. That took half hour to write.
Okay.
Okay, and have gone through very little revision process since, a word here, a word there. And then there are other poems that I'm still wrestling with after after 5 years, 7 years,
Oh my
10
God.
years, and you know, fortunately, as Ezra Pound liked to say, that poetry is news that stays news, and so you hope that even with a poem that's attached to a particular political event, like folding the flag, that there's still going to be some freshness about it, just as we can read poems about the Civil War or World War I, and those are fresh too. Let me read a poem with a little bit of a revelation that's a little more lighthearted.
Well, is this from the baseball?
This is from the baseball.
I should say this
yeah.
book is a series of poems. They're all individual poems,
Yes.
but the mind or the narrator is a minor league baseball player,
Right.
who is about to turn 30, and his wife is pregnant, and he's still trying to make it into the big leagues.
Right.
I think it's safe to say we're not revealing any secrets. They're not really about baseball. But,
Well, they
They're
are
about-
about. I had the good luck one time to take a course with Philip Roth, and Roth was telling a story about getting students to talk about Moby Dick, and everybody was saying, well, it's about, you know, humanity versus nature. It's about, you know, fate in the universe, and he said it took about 15 minutes to get somebody to say it's about whales. so Roth would always write in our margins, you know, where are the whales? And so it is about baseball. But you're right. It's when I was trying to sell this book, I'd like to tell people it's about baseball the way Moby Dick is about whales.
I know.
So.
That's what I was saying. Yeah. But I mean, I've read this book. They're very. I really like a lot of the poems in here. But so you're gonna.
Yeah. And this is a poem called Extra Innings, and Joe has given you the main idea of the poem, that we have a player who's getting a little older, and his wife is pregnant. His wife's name is Adele. That's you should know that. Extra Innings, and here they are playing a game that is about to enter its 32nd inning. Okay, and it has a little epigraph that I've wrenched woefully out of context from Roger Angell, the great New Yorker baseball writer. The end of this game may never come. Extra innings. Playing since 2, I look up at the blackened midsummer sky. 3 up, 3 down, 3 up, 3. Top of the 32nd as we head for the all-time pro record. The hell we are, yells Ed in center. 50 if you play a pop into an inside the park. Next guy, a lefty, wearily lofts one shallow. And before I can think of rapacious obstetricians and my helpless baby, instinct has me under it, and I'm jogging in, Ed calling me a blankety blank. Too bushed to do anything in our half, so the game enters, good God, the 33rd inning. As night cools down, I hallucinate that winter's coming and we'll still be tied. Icicles hanging off the fielders' caps, the diamond needing to be plowed every other inning, the game spiraling on without end. No one else can play either team ever again. My baby's born, I can't help Adele, not there to choose a name. I miss the high school graduation and the wedding and my first grandkid, and I see myself falling down dead, diving for a liner in the top of the 100,000th, spearing it to keep us tied.
It's a very nice poem.
Yeah, thank you.
The one thing I liked about this book,
Mhm.
I think when we think of minor leaguers, we all think of Bull Durham. But the narrator in all these poems is kind of an intellectual, and I mean, I think he's reading Faulkner and Pride and Prejudice, and you know, there's
There's one poem that compares baseball to Jane Austen novels, which is.
But the poem I liked, there was a poem in there called Class of '80.
Yeah.
I think the baseball player, he wants to be a professor or something, and he goes back to visit his professors, and all they're talking about is baseball, and I think he wants to go back and talk about books and everything, but all they want to know about is baseball. So I found it kind of a very ironic poem. But one can't read these without thinking, did you play minor league baseball?
I did not. I
Okay,
did not.
'cause-
This is a great fantasy of mine. An idea the idea was that I could indulge my fantasy about being a baseball player by writing about it. But even in my fantasies, I fail. I mean, this is a guy who has not made the majors, who's not going to make the majors. What he does have is a happy family life, and you know that redeems him. And I realized a long time after I'd written this book that of course it was also about my own fear that you know here was I working at something, poetry, as hard as he had worked at baseball for many years, and it's difficult to get published, and so the book comes at least partly, although I didn't realize it until later, out of wondering whether I was going to have a career as a poet, whether things were going to get published.
What would be the equivalent of the big leagues for a poet, I guess?
Oh, oh, let's see. I don't know. Books published by Forrest Strauss Giroux and reviewed on the front page of the New York Times, or I guess, and then the Hall of Fame would be the Pulitzer or the Nobel or something like that. Right. It's too much to hope for. Yeah, the poem that you're talking about, Class of '80, he goes back and he has an address to his professors at the end. Hey, academics, dear tenured intellects who believe that love of baseball is rooting for the Red Sox, think of the rest of us in the sticks, rotting on the brink in the Fargos and Omahas, dying in chrysalis like Gehrig's string of backups awaiting a terrible miracle, and damn well paying our dues whether or not the goddamn alumni news takes note. Yeah.
Have you, I mean, I don't know, have any minor league baseball players ever written you? Has this book ever made it to any baseball players?
Not that I know of. I have sent it, let's see, I've sent it to a number of players. I had the good luck to go to a World Series game in 1998, and I sent a copy of it. I sent my scorecard off to Tino Martinez, who hit a Grand Slam home run in the game that I went to, and I sent him a copy of the book, but no acknowledgement. But I did send a copy of the book off to Phil Rizzuto, the Yankee Hall of Fame shortstop and former announcer, because a couple of guys had the brilliant idea of taking excerpts from Rizzuto's baseball broadcasts and cutting them up into poems.
Oh, okay.
It's a very funny book called Oh Holy Cow, and all the proceeds from it, I think, go to Rizzuto's favorite charities. So I sent it off to Rizzuto and got this lovely lengthy message back from him. A real poet. it was very funny.
Well, a question I had about, we can talk about how you make a poem or how you write one. When you writing a series or a sequence with the same narrator, and your other book, First Hand, is about a man and his bride-to-be working on a dairy farm,
dairy farming,
which ends in their wedding night. Is that different than just an individual poem? If you're writing a sequence, I mean, do they come separately? Do you write them in order, or do you think I'm going to write 15 baseball poems in a row?
That's an excellent question. Usually I conceive of something as a sequence, that this is something that the farming idea, this is something that really demands more than one poem. And what I have always done with sequences is certainly not worked on them in order. I've written as many poems as I could, covering as many angles of an idea, of a subject as I could, and then seeing how they fit together. And sometimes that certainly entails revising some in light of what some other poems are doing. Sometimes it entails throwing out some poems entirely that don't work. The cutoff was interesting because it began as a single poem. It began as a long poem, which now is mostly one of the poems in here, called Out in Left Field. But it began as a long poem that was about 150 lines, and it was pretty bad. And what I ended up doing was going through it and circling little nuggets and spinning each of these ideas out into its own poem. So that's a poem that grew from something smaller into something.
So several of the poems in there came from this discarded 150 line.
Right. And then, then the trick about a sequence is how do you know when it's done? What you want to have, even though the cutoff has kind of a narrative, it follows this player through a single season in his minor league life, in which several things happen to him. His first child born, he turns 30, but you also need to know what the sequence still needs and when it's ended, when it's over. And I remember very distinctly thinking, usually I don't work like this, but I remember very distinctly looking at the poems I had for this book and thinking, there's not enough death in here. And I mean, that sounds like a very cynical thing to say, but as a result, I began writing a couple of poems in which I decided that my hero's father would have died of terminal disease. There were a couple of poems that deal with him having had cancer. And then the reactions I got to this book were very interesting because I had people who know me sort of well, but don't know all the details about my personal life, writing me and saying, I was so moved to read the poems about your father, and it's entirely fiction, entirely invented.
Well, speaking of that, though, in your book here, How We Came to Stand on That Shore, the whole first sequence is about your grandparents and parents.
Yes.
Many of them. Is that, did they fit together the same way with the baseball? Were you thinking, do you just have a bunch and sort of thought they would all belong together, or?
Yeah, that's really more or less how that worked. I think the first poem I wrote for this book was a grandparents' poem, and then I just got interested in my grandparents' lives. My grandparents were all Eastern European immigrants, and I didn't know a whole lot about them. And by the time I decided I wanted to write about them, they were all dead. And so my parents had some anecdotes and stories, but I had to invent quite a bit. And
well, the one poem in there about them going to the movies and what?
Oh, the
thinking it's real. Is that a true story?
No, that's absolutely fake. And I kick myself sometimes because I kind of make my grandparents seem like greenhorns. It's a long poem, so I won't read the whole thing. But the section that you're referring to is, I imagine my grandparents going off to a movie theater, one of these great movie palaces, and the movie that they're seeing is the Robert Flaherty documentary Nanook of the North. And I thought that the parallel between watching these people in a very alien culture and trying to adapt to a new culture themselves would work. And in the point you're referring to, there's a scene where Nanook is shown a record player for the first time, hugging a Victrola. Nanook laughs, searching for the miniature crooner, and we as the audience, I think, are supposed to be amused that he doesn't understand this record player. Sober, logical, white dry goods merchant holds up record, points to groove. Nanook laughs. My grandfather gripped his armrests. He shouldn't rush up to the screen and peek behind. So imagining them seeing their first movie, when in fact people who did see early movies would bail out of the way when they saw a train approaching on the screen. That seemed to me reasonable, and I hope I didn't take them too much to task.
No.
Let me read one poem from
No,
here.
several of these poems
Yeah,
about here are very, very touching. I think there's several about, isn't there one about your grandmother having the Alzheimer's? Or?
Yes. Okay, I'll read that then. That's a short one. My grandmother in the home. The blue lounge sofa stank of disinfectant. I'd brought a bunch of iris but forgot to give them to her, and clutched their damp wrapper all my stay. And if her quavery hands had welcomed them, oh, flowers, she might think, but wouldn't think to say a word. I closed my eyes, and she sat at the table in her kitchen with a tall glass of tea, reading Bashevis Singer in the foreword. That man, she'd laugh, a sewer for a mind, or toting up the dollars in the black book Zadie never understood. And if she wrenched the flowers from my hand, and if she said a word, it'd be, "Are you my son?" or I must find my mother. I missed her, searching, later, comatose, curled up. Even now she blinked at the strange framed faces about her in her room. I don't think I ever remembered her so small. Her dress was simple as a pillowcase. Her bedspread and sheets were blue, her hair cut close like a steel bonnet. She kept her hands folded in her lap as she stared out past the door, awaiting visitors who wouldn't arrive.
Now, when you were young, did your grandparents live with your family?
No, they didn't.
Right.
They didn't. We lived in Queens. I grew up in New York City. We were in Queens. They were in Brooklyn. But it was always a Sunday ritual to go and visit them. And this poem comes almost verbatim from my. It's almost an exact description of my memories of my last visit with her in a nursing home.
Well, so many poems, it seems, they're about this, like an isolated moment, I guess, where some emotional reaction, I guess, would come.
Yeah, and that's a difference between the way the way poetry works and the way fiction works, I think. In fiction you have usually an alternation of scene and summary. You have a crisis moment or a highlight, and then you have the narration filling you in on what has gone in over the next 2 months or the next 5 years or whatever it happens to be. And usually you don't have that summary in poetry. It's all the acute moments. It's all the lyrical high points. And so that's what telling a narrative. That's what giving narrative in poems, in a sequence of poems, is like. And I like that. I like letting the reader fill in the blanks in between.
I was wondering. How, a lot of magazines still have poems in them, and what's the approach of reading a poem? Or should there even be one? I mean, when you turn the page and you see a poem there, does it go back to,
the other way?
Does it go back to like school when you always had to analyze everything? Or, if we see a poem somewhere, should we have some kind of approach, or just read it and see what?
I see what you mean. There's a wonderful recording of William Carlos Williams reading his poetry, and he says to the audience, "Just let it roll over you." He's got this great New Jersey accent. He says, "Just get the smell of it." He says, and there's certainly a lot to be said for that, because if you come at it thinking that this is something to be picked apart and analyzed, that's going to ruin the fun.
I'm thinking from school, when you see a poem, you first thought, "Oh no, I'm going to have to analyze that."
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think the important thing is to enter into it with a sympathetic frame of mind and see what kind of world the poet is trying to create for you, what kind of mini universe, and what kind of experience the poet is asking you to have. Because when we try to analyze poems too much at first, when we're first reading them, then we can lose track of the fact that they have something interesting and urgent to say, and we can lose track of the fact that they're from human beings and usually about human beings or about something that's important to the human world. Yeah.
Well, we're almost at the end, so I had a question.
Yeah.
I read once, or I think Billy Collins, former poet laureate, he wrote a poem about how in high school he carried around with him Coney Island of the Mind by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. So that book was obviously important to him. Is there a certain poet or a book of poems that is important to you that you keep returning to that maybe anyone watching could maybe investigate on?
Yeah, there are a few poets that who have been very important to me at various times. When I was first starting to write, John Berryman was a poet that I liked a lot. He's somebody that's difficult to write about because his style is very spiky and quirky, but John Berryman's dream songs are an amazing set of poems about a character's adventures. They're a sequence, not as rigidly narrative as many sequences. Randall Jarrell is a poem that I still keep coming back to. A poet here I keep coming back to. He's a poet whose work I just love. And what I like about Jarrell is his ability to sympathize. He writes a lot of monologues, and late in his career, he wrote a lot of monologues in the voices of women. Poems like Next Day, The Woman at the Washington Zoo, The Lost Children, The Player Piano. They're some of my favorites. And I still catch myself sounding like Jarrell every now and then. I have the poem that's going to begin my next book, which is coming out in 2008, a book called The Long Fault, begins. It's a poem about Cain and Abel, and it begins, "The blood cried up from the ground, and the air held its breath." And the air held its breath is a very Jarrell-like line. I didn't realize it at the time I was writing it, but that's the kind of thing that he will do. Another poet I admire very much is A.R. Ammons, and he's a poet who lived much of his life in Ithaca. He was a biologist, and so his poems often have to do with natural processes. He also loved to write sentences that go on and on and on and on about natural processes going on and on and on and on. And if we have time, I've got a poem about him that I could read or rewrite.
Sure.
How are we doing?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a poem about.
This is a poem. It's a tribute to Ammons, and it's a poem called "A Breakdown." Ammons died in 2001, so I wrote this poem as a memorial. The one thing that you should probably know about Ammons before I read this is that his favorite punctuation mark was the colon, and so I play around with the idea of colons in here. A breakdown. Coming from anywhere, your poems, they traveled anywhere. Rucksack on the back, hitching up dungarees, hitching a ride, sentencing down the road, letting their hair down, letting themselves tumble down scroll-like and pushing their lines through all those colons, never flinching from all the nonsense we push through our colons, compost being our biodegradable identity, giving away the game, giving off heady perfumes, signaling, hey, all the crap we spin out of ourselves, haute cuisine for someone else, a fly, say, or bacteria, imagination, just another enzyme, how the whole damned process of breaking down never breaks down. Whoa, never ends. Only that in the localist terms, we end, ending up broke down into spelling, and if we're lucky, intimations of some glory and some end that we use to distract us from that glory and that end.
I like the "if we're lucky" part.
If we're lucky, yes, right.
Well, we really want to thank you for coming down, and
It's really been a
being
pleasure.
the
to
author.
be
And
here.
your next book will be out in 2008.
Yeah,
and
2008, The Long
Are
Fault.
your books in the local bookstores, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Amazon, the libraries.
Very. I got mine just from the library. So we really appreciate your coming, and well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Meet the Author.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.